All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, I am Steve Carpenter. I'm the Michael J. and Aimee Rusinko Kakos Dean in the College of Arts and Architecture at the Pennsylvania State University. That's a long intro, but that's who I am. I'm thrilled that you're here, and I'm also thrilled that you are here because if you weren't here, we wouldn't have a conversation. I would just be talking to myself. This is Rahman Azari, who is associate professor in architecture in the Stuckman School in the College of Arts and Architecture. Today, we're talking about the Routledge Handbook of Embodied Carbon in the Built Environment. That's not a title that rolls off the tongue easily, but it's an important topic, right? It's an important title. So the plan is we're going to have a little conversation. I have some questions that I've prepared, but it's also going to be a little conversation as well. I have some questions that you know about and some questions you don't know about.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation about all those questions. Some of the questions, I don't even know what they are because they'll emerge from our conversation. And then after we have a bit of a chat, we'll open it up to all of you to have a good conversation. What do you say? All right. All right, Dr. Azari, I have a question for you, sir. Why is this book necessary now?
Well, thank you so much, Dean Carpenter, for this invitation and for the opportunity to share my work. And thank you so much, everyone. So, a few years ago, especially in the past decade, I would say that this topic of embodied carbon has gained a lot of significance, and the main reason for that is that we in the built environment traditionally has been focusing on energy efficiency as a measure of environmental sustainability of buildings, which is true, of course, very important area. But then people have started to pay attention that, okay, we are now able to build these net zero energy buildings, the buildings that are able to produce as much energy as they consume, so we are able to do that. But then still, we have buildings, even net zero energy buildings, that are associated with a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then those greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions, come primarily from the manufacturing of all of those materials that we use in the buildings. So in a way, we are reducing the energy consumption, but through reduction of energy consumption, we are adding to materiality of the buildings. For example, we need now more insulation.
Okay.
We now need more double pane windows, triple pane windows. For all of those to be manufactured in a manufacturing facility, energy needs to be produced.
Correct.
Used, and then GHG emissions will be released. So then there was this awareness about those GHG emissions and the fact that we need to be able to capture them, to quantify them, and find ways to reduce them.
Got it.
So according to the data, there is this 11% of total global greenhouse emissions in the world is because of the embodied carbon. And when I say embodied carbon, is the GHG emissions associated with the materiality and the construction of the buildings.
Got it. And associated with the production of those materials as well as once they are installed or part of the new construction, what they emit at that point as well.
Exactly. So we have raw materials that are extracted from their source, transported into manufacturing facility. All of those building systems are produced. Then we have to transport them into the construction site. Building is assembled or constructed and then maintained. After 25 years, perhaps we need to replace windows and buy new windows. And then at some point, perhaps we want to demolish maybe the buildings. So through that entire life cycle, energy is consumed at different stages, maybe for fuel of that truck that is bringing all of the materials into the construction site. And greenhouse gas emissions are released in that entire process. So embodied carbon captures that entire GHG emissions with the exception of the GHG emissions associated with the energy that we use for operation of the building, for heating, cooling, lighting, etc. That's called embodied carbon.
Got it. Okay.
So there was this the tendency and this trend in the industry to capture that. If we want to reduce the global greenhouse gas emissions, people needed to realize that that is 11%. So we have to reduce it.
Got it.
And then different countries started to even establish regulations with regard to embodied carbon. Because currently in the US, for example, we don't have any regulation with regard to embodied carbon.
There's no regulation in the US for embodied carbon.
There is no regulation. There are some voluntary systems like Leadership in Energy Environmental Design. Those are all voluntary systems. They have some regulations. But when it comes to the mandatory regulations for all buildings, we don't have regulations for embodied carbon. There are some countries like Denmark, like Norway, like France. These countries have already started to establish regulations. So they have regulations in place, meaning that if you build a certain building of certain size, your embodied carbon cannot exceed a certain limit, which then forces architects to think about materiality of the buildings. Then they would think that, well, first, I cannot use any material I want. Second, that I have to pay attention to the transportation distances, where I get my material, the source of my materials. So all of those becomes important in discussions.
Got it. So it's interesting to think about the life span, right, or the life cycle that you talked about. What seems to be, at least among students or colleagues, I understand those are two different areas. At what point is of most interest to students or colleagues? Is it the embodied carbon? Is it the manufacturing piece? Is it the after demolition and how we reclaim? Is there a component on that continuum that seems more attractive to people than others?
That's a great question. I think traditionally we have, as I mentioned before, we have done a little work on energy efficiency and what we call operational carbon, which is the carbon associated with the energy efficiency. When it comes to embodied carbon, I think there has been a lot of research by my colleagues, by students regarding materiality. People have been paying attention to regional materials and the fact that we need to use materials that are regionally sourced. I think the problem is that we have not been able to do a lot of quantification of it. To communicate the quantities of it.
The communication of the quantities or the actual measuring?
Actual measuring. And the main reason for us not being able to make it more popular to measure it has been because there has been no standard way of measuring it. People have had different ways of doing it, so there has been no standardized method of doing it. The data has been an issue, the quality of the data, I mean, because you need to have data from manufacturers with regard to the environmental, what we call it, environmental product declaration, EPD, that each manufacturer ideally would report the environmental impacts associated with their products. For example, if you're using this cell phone, you have to know that how much global warming potential of this cell phone is, or what is the acidification potential of it, or what is the eutrophication potential of it. So this is not common for manufacturers to report the EPDs. And then once you have even your EPDs, there is no standardized method to use those data into a framework in order to capture and quantify embodied carbon. But this has changed, of course, in the past few years. Now, there are more rigorous methods and standardization is happening. So there's a lot of efforts in that area. I think the awareness about materiality has been there, to answer your question, but then reporting and quantification of that has been more an issue.
Got it. So you mentioned a few countries, Finland, Norway, France, right? I assume that they're leading the way, or those countries are essentially laying the groundwork for maybe a more global mode of accounting. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And I think there's a reason for that. These countries are relatively small countries compared with the US. The size of the economy is smaller. the size of the construction sector in those countries are smaller as well compared with the US. If you want to make a change in the US in the construction sector, that's going to be huge change, that you have to change the culture, you have to change the business models. So many things must change in order to a slight improvement in certain area for it to happen. But in those countries, everything is smaller. Change is easier to happen. But I see that even in the US, there is this change is happening actually. And our students now talk about embodied carbon when they're communicating their design proposals. They talk not only about energy consumption of their projects, but also what is the embodied carbon. They talk about mass timber. When they talk about mass timber, they even talk about how much mass timber is able to reduce the environmental impact and embodied carbon of their projects.
And it sounds like they talk about it more now as an integral component of their work, of their designs, rather than an additional component or an afterthought. Is that fair?
Absolutely, that would be ideal. Yeah, and yes, they are doing it. That's the culture that we would like for our students to develop, to look at all of these different ways of quantifying the building's environmental impacts as a way to inform the design, rather than just I design and then I use these tools in order to communicate what is my impact.
Yeah.
Instead, you want to know your impact in order to refine your design, make it better, improve it, go back to assess it again, and then continue this cycle in order to get to a design that is not only is functional, not only is poetic, but also is good for public health, good for the environment, and so forth.
So it's integral to the design process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. If we have any students in the audience, I hope they heard what you said. Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Already know.
I'm sure they did. So let's go to weave back to the book more specifically. You mentioned a few countries: Finland, Norway, France, and I didn't count the number of countries, but I'm going to read this list of countries that I pulled from the book based on where the authors of these different chapters currently work. Now, you didn't write the whole book. You have a co-editor, so the two of you, and we'll talk about the editing process and all of that. So there are how many chapters in here?
25.
25 chapters. So listen to this list of countries: Denmark, Netherlands, China, Spain, UK, Canada, Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, and the United States. That's a pretty good representation of much of the world. But I noticed that there are 3 continents that aren't really addressed: Australia, Africa, and South America. So how did tell me about how these authors came to be, and we get that representation from a certain part of the globe, and there are other parts of the globe that are not represented, at least from where the authors currently work.
We invited people from all continents and many countries, from India to South Africa to other countries. I think one challenge in the field of embodied carbon is that we need good data, good quality data, and sometimes the databases that we need in order to develop a good embodied carbon assessment doesn't exist in some countries. So there is a push, of course, in these countries to develop their own national databases. But this is a conversation that even in the US we must have as well.
Right.
That we need to have better data. We need to have better methodology. And this book, and for me and Professor Moncaster, who is the other co-author of this book, the reason that we approached all of these people was that we looked at this as a learning experience for ourselves as well. We wanted to learn, not only just to, for example, teach other people, but for myself, learning from all of these people in some of great countries who are doing research at the cutting edge research regarding embodied carbon, for us to learn what is missing, for example, in the US, that we haven't been able to do it in terms of the data, in terms of the methodology, in terms of the threshold. What are your benchmarks? What is good embodied carbon or bad embodied carbon? So all of those are missing pieces that we need to work globally together in order to develop better understanding. And I think that was my main reason that some of those countries who are more prepared in order to communicate their work appear more often in this work.
Yeah, got it. It's interesting to me, as much as we talk about embodied carbon or carbon emissions or greenhouse gases, to think that there's not more of a standard approach, or at least a mode of measurement that is more widely accepted. That's really so. I mean,
Yes.
This is part of the contribution that this book makes, I would suggest.
Yes, absolutely. So the scholars are reporting about their methods of quantifying embodied carbon, and in many ways we learned that in many parts these methods are the same. There are some differences, but
Sure.
in the way that we report, there are huge differences sometimes in reporting of the result,
Got
not
it.
necessarily in the quantification of that. And then this is an opportunity for us to think about how we could standardize those methods as well. Several, I would say most of the co-authors and authors of this book are also present in the International Energy Agency's Annex 89 project. And then that project, the aim is to make the embodied carbon estimation a standardized method. And I think that would help as well.
Okay. I'm sure there's value in having multiple ways to measure, but certainly, I mean, that could be related to cultural preferences, right, and certain practices locally, but I can also see merit in a more global standard. So, co-editor is different than co-author.
Yes.
However, you are also a co-author of some of the sections of the book, and you are a single author of one of the chapters.
Yes.
And there are other chapters that have co-authors,
Yes.
and some of those co-authors are single authors of other chapters.
Very complicated.
It is. That's a lot of trouble.
So I think the project has started with me reaching out to Professor Moncaster, suggesting that, are you willing for us to collect work in this field?
Yep.
And Professor Moncaster at the time was at Cambridge, so she had done a lot of work in that area. She had published books in that field, and she demonstrated a lot of interest in that idea. And then we started to identify people. We didn't want to have a public invitation. We wanted to reach out to people who we knew that are doing serious research in this field. So we reached out to people from different universities, from different countries, continents, and then invited them to contribute. And then there was 30 chapter contributions that people proposed that we would be able to contribute to this. Over the process, 5 of those chapters were not eventually ended up in the book, but then 25 chapters were included. And then the idea would be that we wanted for us to report our own work as well.
Sure.
That's why in some of those chapters, we are as author or co-author.
That makes sense. That's really helpful. So the role of the editor, the role of the co-editors is to gather all of these contributions, order them. They're divided into sections. But at the beginning of the process, you and your co-editor, Alice Moncaster, you proposed this idea. You had this vision of what this collection could be. But it didn't start out as a book, if I understand correctly, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So we wanted to present the most updated, most recent work in this field. So we started with the idea of a symposium. We had this Embodied Carbon Symposium in 2022, November, that we held. And we had an idea of the book, but we weren't sure whether that would end up being a book. So we started with the symposium. And the symposium, I think, they created the opportunity for, like I was telling the incorporators, like a design studio. In design studio, you work on your design project, you go through rounds of presentation and iterations, and then at some point, you reach to the peak of perfection, ideally at the end of the studio, and then you present to the public. The symposium for us was like those mid-reviews and those iterations. We wanted to get feedback from people. And then there were moments that there were some authors that completely changed their methodology even because of the feedback that people received during the symposium. So that created an opportunity for us to collect feedback. That as co-editors, that also created an opportunity for us to see the work, because the work that is written and the work that is presented would have different level of sophistication that people would understand that. So we were able to understand better the work through the presentations, and then we went through rounds of iterations and review and blind review of all of these chapters before we thought that, okay, the book is ready. And then over this process, we were in contact with Routledge as well. And it was Routledge's suggestion that we should publish this as a Routledge handbook.
Yes.
Initially, the book was Embodied Carbon in the Built Environment, but they said that the book is good enough to become part of the Routledge Handbook series.
That's fantastic. I know one of the criteria, or at least one of the characteristics of a handbook, is that you have a collection of chapters related to a specific topic, typically divided into subtopics, but that any of those chapters could be pulled out and stand alone, but then but that each of those chapters then helps elaborate the larger project. Is that fair?
That is correct. So the way that we divided this into the book into sections was that you have certain debates and questions about embodied carbon, but then embodied carbon could be attacked from three angles: at material scale, at building scale, and at urban scale. And then each of these have different levels of sophistication, has different embodied carbon mitigation strategies, different ways of quantifying them, and people reported on all of those. And then the most sophisticated component was that urban scale embodied carbon that is so difficult and complex to quantify. That so at building scale, we have all of these issues, but then when it comes to urban scale, it becomes even worse in terms of the complexity of the work, I would say immaturity of the methodology in some part, that there is a potential for work in that area, but still people had done some work that we wanted them to report.
Does it also make it more difficult in the urban space because there's just more material around and it's more difficult to isolate on particular buildings and materials?
Yeah, we have different types of buildings. Let's imagine that we want to measure the embodied carbon of a state college. Then we have buildings that have been built in pre-1900, 19 to 1950, 1950 to 1980, 1980 to 2000, and so forth. Each of these types of buildings are built with different types of materials, with different construction practices. You don't have a lot of data about, for example, where does this brick that is used in a building in 1900 in a state college comes from what distance? So there's a lot of uncertainty involved that needs to be captured.
And there's not a database that you're saying, right? Is that something that could be constructed?
That is what I'm hoping that, there's a lot of people who are doing work in this area. And I have a PhD student, Elnaz Qasemi. We are working on a project in Baltimore. It's a grant that is funded by DOE, the U.S. Department of Energy. We're trying to use Baltimore as a case study in order to assess the effect of densification, urban densification, on embodied carbon and operational carbon in Baltimore.
Got it.
So, for example, in Baltimore, we have this in any city, perhaps, we have zoning policy. Zoning policy tells us that in downtown, you have to build up to this height, up to this density, right? But then no one knows what is that carbon emission implication of those zoning guidelines. If I build up to this height and up to this density, how much carbon I'm going to release through the economy, through the construction sector? Part of it is embodied carbon, part of it is operational carbon. So in that PhD research, Elnaz is trying to quantify that. And as part of that, you have to classify, you have to divide the city into all of these zones and different types of housing built at different stages. And you have to make a lot of assumptions because you don't have data.
Right.
But it is a starting point.
Sure.
We are hoping to be able to create a starting point for quantification of those.
Well, that's the only place that anything important takes place. Is you
Yes.
need to have a starting point. You need a baseline, and that's fantastic. So I have a few more questions that I want to ask you about the book, but also as it relates to the research and the methodology. It's just fascinating. I'm learning so much.
Thank you.
I need to hang out with you more often.
I'm learning as well.
Which is really an important element. I mean, you've shared that part of the symposium was for researchers to learn from each other,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And that process of presenting information, your research, getting the feedback, the editing process, the review process, it's all about learning. So this is although it's a standard handbook, there will be future iterations, maybe different volumes, maybe spin-offs.
Absolutely, and this is all about knowledge that after a few years, especially at this age, you lose relevance because the knowledge and science moves so fast. Then maybe this book that was published in 2023 maybe is completely irrelevant in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years because the methodology becomes more mature, data becomes more mature, that you redo all of these analysis and you try to answer the same problem, but you will get completely different results because of the level of maturity in methodology and lesser uncertainty in the results and data, etc.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yes, it's not a bad thing at all.
Yeah. You almost become like the butterfly's wing that creates the hurricane, right? I mean, you start this thing off, people respond and build on the work you started.
Yes.
So we talked a bit about co-author and co-editor. So you co-authored the introduction, right? And you authored chapter 7 by yourself. Okay, so that's 2. You counting? Just count 2. Then you also co-authored chapters 12, 16, and 21, all of those were co-authored with Alice Moncaster, right?
Yes.
So it's 3 and 2, that's 5, right? It's 5 chapters. That's a nice little book by itself. Here's my question. Why not just publish the shorter co-authored book rather than a longer co-edited book? It's really, that's a serious question, although it seems like it's a little, little off the cuff. Why not publish something a little more concise and focused on the work that you and Alice Moncaster do?
Sure. I think the main reason was that we wanted to create a book that would be high quality, that people would refer to. And that would have been achieved only through teamwork. So we needed everyone to contribute so that we produce something that would become a point of reference for the community.
Yeah, I like that. Part of why I like that, maybe the majority of why I appreciate that response is what I heard you say is the work is more than you and Alice Moncaster and your work specifically. It's about the work of embodied carbon. It's the work of addressing these really important issues globally that we need to have a collective approach.
Yeah, I think there's a point that you realize that outside world pay attention to the solutions, but not necessarily who provides the solution. So people have problems, environmental, social, etc. They need solution. It doesn't matter who proposes solution. So our objective was to propose something that we could make an impact, basically.
That's nice. That's generous. That's really generous because it offers beyond yourself. So having said all that about how nice it is to be generous and not make it about yourself, I'm going to make the next question about you specifically. So chapter 7. So you authored this specifically, and I was intrigued by this because you open up the chapter referencing this concept of paradigm shift that Thomas Kuhn puts out, I think in the 60s, right? He talks about, this major way of shifting. We're doing things this way, and a paradigm shift is I mean, that's a challenge, right? You make a little nuanced adjustment. We make adjustments all day. But to make a paradigm shift, you have to kind of give up what you've believed in and what you've done as practice and make a big shift. And you frame the chapter within that notion, the importance of a paradigm shift. You say, you talk about there's evidence that a form of paradigm shift has been taking place in all sectors, including the construction industry, that aims toward net zero emission status by 2050. That's 25 years from now.
Yes, and
that's not so far down the road, is it?
Exactly.
So talk to us about this paradigm shift in this 25-year distance that we're working on.
There is this book written by David Goldberg, who is a prominent psychologist, and the name of the book is Ecological Intelligence. And he argues in his book that, and it was written I think in 2010, that if we want to live in 21st century and we want to survive 21st century, we need to create a completely different type of intelligence compared with what we're used to. So the concept of danger and risk has changed significantly. The risk and danger for us is not anymore animals trying to eat us.
Well, you don't live in my neighborhood, so yeah, maybe not for you. But, yeah.
So the risk for us is now that we may not be able to survive this maybe 100 years, 200 years, or whatever. So we need to create this ecological intelligence, this ability to constantly assess the decisions based on a certain environmental criteria. So that has to become part of our decision-making process.
Got it.
If cost is currently part of our natural decision-making process, whatever that we want to do, there's a cost element to that. We compare the cost. But then he argues that we have to bring environmental cost, if you will, into equation as well. And the reason that I mentioned that paradigm shift is that in the field of built environments, we need to do that as well. We are doing it maybe at some level, but we need to become more serious about that. And we need to look at it not from the perspective of, okay, I'm designing this and then I'm doing it in a sustainable way. Design must be sustainable as well. So it is part of the design, those environmental decision making. And not only that, but also the health impact, the social costs of that. All of that, we must have awareness about those. What is the social cost of this cell phone that I'm now trying to use? What is the health impacts of it? What is the environmental impact? And all of that, we must reach that level of sophistication to integrate that into part of our decision making, and we need to do that in the construction sector as well.
Absolutely, it's the complexity of this paradigm shift and the complexity of the contemporary frameworks that we're using really elevates the urgency, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yes.
All right, a couple other questions, Rahman, and then we'll get to my 5 special questions for you. You know a couple of them, but you don't know all. You know 2 of them. You don't know all of them, though. That's by design, because we're going to put you on the hot seat with those. So this is mid-April or early April 2025. I think I'd be remiss, but also understanding that this might be a delicate question here. This book is you folks are talking about issues related to climate change, right? Global climate conditions. You're talking about environmental issues. You're talking, there are chapters in here that talk about the developing world and housing needs, right? Talking about issues of equity as much as sustainability. These are words that are raising red flags nationally in this country, and in response to information mandates, funding stoppages for some of these topics for people who are doing the work that you're doing and others are doing. this is a really challenging area to work in. How are you and your co-authors feeling about all of this?
I think people will find their ways of doing things. The values do not change, but words could change.
Mm-hmm.
So we just will use a lot of synonyms these days.
A lot of synonyms, absolutely, yeah.
But the values remain constant.
The values remain constant. The goals and the focus remains constant. Mm-hmm. One of the things I've been saying in the college is that it is arts and design as usual, right? Yes. We're not business people, so we don't say business as usual. But we say arts and design as usual, right? Because those values and the vision and the importance of that work doesn't change. So sometimes it gets more challenging, but doesn't make it less important.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's where I'm sitting. All right. This was a big project. Started out Symposium 2022, right? A few years later, you have this book. What's the next big project?
Well, I'm working on the idea. The next step to this project for me was about. I realized that many of my students do not have a good textbook in a way, to help them learn about life cycle assessment, which is a methodology to assess embodied carbon. Mm-hmm. So that is currently my next book project.
I like how you had an instant answer to that. You didn't know I was going to ask that question. I like how you had an instant answer. Another symposium will be the beginning, or will this be a single authored book?
I have not. For now, I'm thinking about it as a co-authored book, not co-edited book. Yeah. But we'll see.
Okay, we'll see. You heard it here first, folks. You heard it here first. All right, let me check the time here. Okay, we're in good shape. So, I have 5 questions for you. These are supposed to be, hey, I have a question, you give it back. Sure. Give it back to me. This is where we get to really know about what this guy's about. All right. What's your favorite word?
This is one of those.
Yeah, you know that. You knew I was going to ask this one. Yeah, what's your favorite word?
Well, I think it may look very cliche, but I was thinking about what is my most and least favorite words. And from a cliche perspective, I think I really like the word light, because in many ways represents, it's a symbol of many good things, from hope to positivity to many things. So we like it everywhere. Yeah. There is this, Leonard Cohen is one of my favorite singers, and he has this song Anthem, and then there is this part in that says that there is a crack in everything, but that's how the light gets in.
Oh, wow.
So, and this is a representation of imperfection, and all of these problems that we have. But then through those cracks, we have the light that gets in. So I like that poem as well.
Oh, nice. I'm going to think about light differently now. Thanks. So, what's your least favorite word?
I know that we have to be very neutral in science and judgment, but I think neutral is a word that I don't like a lot.
You're not neutral about neutral.
So, because it has this sense of, it brings this sense of you don't have commitment to something. You want to be safe with things. You don't belong to either sides. So in some ways, I understand the value of it in some areas, but I also see the problems of it as well.
You want somebody to, come on, make a decision, make a choice, right? Be decisive, acknowledge your subjectivity, even when your subjectivity is, I want to be neutral. That's a lot of work to stay neutral.
Yeah, even in your objectivity, you have subjectivity.
100%. Right? That's it, yeah. All right. What is your least favorite season?
I think it is winter.
See, this is one he didn't know I was going to ask.
Yes, winter.
You think it's winter. Why do you think it's winter?
Well, I have lived in locations with long winters a lot, and I don't consider State College, by the way, among the longest one.
Okay.
I lived in Chicago and the other places. So it is, because of the winter, you have to remain inside. Then if you want to be outside, I think that's creates, I mean, at least for me, it creates problems. So
okay, that works. What's your favorite game to play?
Video game, or we were talking with the
It's a game, whatever. Could be video game, could be
car race. Any car race is my favorite.
like Mario
video game.
Kart, car race, that kind of thing?
There was, when I was chatting, some students of mine and I were attending the ARCC conference in Washington, D.C. a few days ago. On the way back, I was driving them to a state college, and we were chatting about the same thing. And then there was this, I don't know if you folks remember, there was this video game, Need for Speed.
Yes.
You folks remember? So when I was doing
you know, as a dean, this is scaring me. You're saying a faculty member is driving students, and you're talking about need for speed. Okay, yeah, go on.
I was driving safely.
Yes, I know you must. Go ahead, keep going.
So in 2002, I was preparing to do my master's degree, and then somebody introduced Need for Speed to me. And then for 3 months, I was constantly playing Need for Speed. That significantly delayed my master's in defense. My parents were not happy with me. They were saying, you're addicted to this. So yes, video game Need for Speed, but I will stop playing.
Okay.
Because I know that level of addiction.
Very good, I like that. All right, last question, and then we'll open it up to these experts out here, all right? If you were not an architect, what would you be?
Probably a baker.
A baker?
Yes.
Again, no hesitation, and you didn't know I was going to ask this question.
Baking is one of those, and I don't know baking, by the way. I have tried it. I have tried it a couple of times with good, successful outcome, but beyond that, no, I've not tried. But this is one of those things that I badly want to learn someday.
Okay.
And have my own bakery, because I feel that it is something that through the human history, our ancestors have reached perfection in doing it, and this is a product that through generations have been with us, bread.
Yeah.
And so I like bread, any type of bread, and I like to be a baker someday, maybe after retirement.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to link this back somehow oddly to what we've been talking about, if that's at all possible. There's materiality with bread.
Yes.
Right? There's a mixture of ingredients that allow us to have something that becomes solid, and there's a form there. You bake correctly, there's some off-gassing that happens, and the aroma of that off-gassing is pretty appetizing.
Sure.
I'm not sure that off-gassing of buildings is appetizing, but there's off-gassing. But also, there's a long history, right? Like you made this parallel with humankind and human history, and bread seems to be some sort of staple in many cultures. Yes. So it's about the people part, and it's about the sustenance and sustainability. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that bread has this simplicity and yet complexity as a food, and I like it a lot. Not only to eat it, but also to think about the processes. And you look at, I was following this Instagram page of Pompeii. There's this group of researchers who are doing the investigations in Pompeii in Italy, and then they were finding bread, the fossil of bread, of course, that has been found from thousands of years ago. It's amazing to think about that people 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago were doing the exact same thing that some people are doing today. And this continuity is amazing.
I like it. Very good. Well, I'm eager to taste your bread when it
the Routledge Handbook of bread baking.
I like that.
That would be
that's your
a book project.
That's the third one. Got it.
After retirement.
100% after retirement. Okay. Got it. All right, let's open it up to the crowd.
Sure.
All right, questions. It could be about carbon emissions. It could be about bread. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
Well, originally I was going to ask you about the political dimension of continuing this work. Since Dean Carpenter already covered that, I was glad to hear that you said that it's okay to just keep going. You don't need to change your field or anything. Although I guess bread baking might be a good fallback if worse comes to worse. So instead, I wonder if you could respond to something that I just read very recently. You mentioned, I was excited to hear you mention, was it ecological intelligence?
Yes.
So what I was just reading referred to biological intelligence, a phrase which was coined apparently by John Todd or somebody like this, who created these ecological machines, biological intelligence in ecological machines, which some people have been referring to as living machines.
And living intelligence recently. Living intelligence is the most recent thing that everyone is talking about it. So yes.
So the premise of this is that instead of relying on the type of paradigm shift where we find that we have to know everything, we have to gather huge amounts of data in order to analytically solve some problems that we've identified. Instead, maybe we can harness this biological intelligence, which has been working on the problems of survival for 3 or 4 billion years, and has, according to this guy, solved pretty much all the problems that there are to solve. So you can take, for example, what he's doing, you can take extremely polluted water, put it through a series of 10 tanks with all kinds of different organisms in them. And at each stage, you'll get different ecosystems. And at the end, you get water clean enough to drink, regardless of how polluted that water was at the beginning. So do you think that these are compatible approaches, possibly? Or is there the feeling that we're confronting problems now that are so big that kind of ancient technology can't hack it, and therefore we have to have this new re-understanding of everything?
Well, I think there is this element of ingenuity or learning from the past that could happen in any innovation. So these are certainly compatible. And then I'm reading this book and that I recommend. It's called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's written by Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab is the founder or co-founder of the World Economic Forum. So in that book, he argues that, well, in previous industrial revolutions, 1, 2, 4, we have been dealing with one dominant technology that is changing the pace and the path for the humanity. But then we are now at the point that multiple technologies, it is a convergence of technologies that are changing our world. And I believe that all of those are presenting unique opportunities for us to look at our problems from unique perspectives, identify patterns in our previous the behavior and cultures and ways of doing that has been problematic to the environment, to the health, to the life, and then find solutions. So we can certainly learn from the past in that way by analyzing them better, by looking at things that were underexplored in the past, that now these technologies would let us see them more clearly and bold them in a way.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, question.
So you mentioned older buildings on campus, and I want to bring a conversation about adaptive reuse. And actually, on our way here, we walked past through demolition going on campus. And I believe that the adaptive reuse, or the mindset of the greenest building, is one that already exists. I feel like this is often overlooked in countries like the United States. I just had a recent study abroad in Copenhagen and was able to be exposed to many adaptive reuse projects. Are embodied carbon standards helping to shift the architectural industry toward more adaptive reuse, or are they still primarily focused on new construction, favoring measurable material substitutions over preservation?
That's a very good question. Of course, the adaptive reuse, as you mentioned, is the greenest option because that we're going to basically reuse the structure or reuse the materials. So in terms of the embodied carbon, there is this project that this company, Lake Flado, you might have heard about it. So a few years ago, they did an adaptive reuse of their own office. So instead of going to a new office, building a new building, they decided to do an adaptive reuse of their own office. And they measured the level of savings that you would be able to achieve using the adaptive reuse approach. And I barely remember, it was 50 to 60% reduction in the carbon emission just by following adaptive reuse. So certainly adaptive reuse is the greenest solution. However, we must also notice that there is a demand for new buildings as well because of the growth of population, that it is inevitable. Even if you have all of these existing buildings, even if you do apply adaptive reuse to all of them, still we need the new construction to happen as well. So I think we have to look at both ways of sustainable doing of the things, both in the field of new construction and adaptive reuse. And I know that in Europe, they have a larger historical and traditional building market and housing stock. So they are more, of course, progressive in doing those type of things. And we could learn from them as well, of course. But also new construction is inevitable as well. And we have to find ways to reduce and minimize and make it even zero to all of these greenhouse gas emissions associated with new construction.
So I would say, given that you say that, I guess in the United States, the demand for new construction, would you say that new material choices and embodied carbon standards are primarily focused over adaptive reuse? And then also, I guess this has a two-part question. Do you kind of see them both emerging together, or one or the other, or one comes first?
I think we have good materials for both adaptive reuse and new construction. There is significant developments in the field of concrete manufacturing. There is significant developments in the field of bio-based materials that could be used in either adaptive reuse or new construction. I think the most notorious material in terms of the carbon is concrete, right? After water, it is the second most used material on the earth, and there needs to be something happening regarding the concrete. And there are a lot of developments in that field, but whether that is enough or not, I don't think so yet, especially if we want to reduce our emissions and may reach net zero status by 2050. We have to find a really rigorous way to do that. Timber sometimes is offered as a solution. I love timber, but I don't think it's a global solution. I was in the conference a couple of years ago in Edinburgh in Scotland, and then there was a great architect presenting his mass timber design project. It was a fascinating project. And then I asked him, a question came to my mind, and I asked him, if everyone decides to build with mass timber on the earth, is it good? What would happen? And then he referred me to the article published in Nature that if you send me an email, I'd be happy to share with you folks. And then in that article, they had argued that if 90% of the housing stock on the earth is built with mass timber in the multifamily housing sector, then we would be able to significantly reduce carbon emissions. However, there are certain environmental impacts in the field of biology, land use, etc., that would be significantly deteriorating the ecosystems on the earth. So mass timber is a good solution where we have timber. In other parts of the world, mineral materials has been used throughout centuries, and maybe those could be solutions. So I feel that sometimes these solutions that we promote in the West becomes a fashion, and then when it becomes fashion, it becomes a dangerous thing because then everyone tries to follow them, regardless of whether that's a good solution or not. So I think we have to be careful in the message that we're sending about the materials.
Great.
generally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. This side of the house, question?
If you give us a chance, we'll take it. So I have a couple questions. Thanks for this interesting conversation. It's sort of two-part, but I'll try to keep it succinct. The first part is just, could you speak to a little bit more about like what carbon is? Like, for example, if I hold a piece of paper over like a candle and I get this sort of soot, and I get up to a ton of that, is that equivalent to what someone says 1 ton of carbon, or what type of material carbon that we interact with in our daily life is a kind of proxy for the kind of carbon that comes up in your conversations? And then the sort of second part of that question, which you've already addressed, so maybe I'm just looking for a bit more, but I also probably have to like really read the book maybe more to get a better sense too. But like, how do architects get a sense for this embodied carbon? I mean, I guess that's what the handbook is for, but I guess the question is like, is there a succinct way you can sort of speak to both how we can teach that and how, because so often you can interact with architects and there's sort of like the notion of the embodied carbon or something is not even, no reference for it, and so much of decision making is actually intuitive, that you sort of feel or have a sense that this might work, but it's hard to have a feeling for tons of things when you can't with your own muscles, your own body kind of kinesthetically move with that kind of weight, so it's always an abstract number. So yeah, is there something sort of within the framework of the book or that it points to that can sort of lead to, on one hand, us having a sense of what really is carbon, and then also how can we have an intuitive sense of its weight vis-a-vis architecture?
Sure, great question. So many materials are made with carbon, so carbon by itself is not a bad thing, right? Even carbon dioxide is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem with the carbon dioxide that we see is that we have too much concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then when we have too much molecules of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it leads to global warming, basically. It traps heat within the atmosphere, doesn't let heat radiate back to the sky, etc. So we experience global warming. So the problem is not carbon dioxide or carbon, the problem is too much concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, and then there are all of these flows of carbon dioxide. Plants absorb them, and then we release carbon dioxide. So on the average, and as a net, we are releasing more, I think it's, if I remember the number correctly, 5,000 gigatons of carbon at global scale we are emitting on a net, as a net figure. I think so. I think it's 5,000 gigatons. So the problem is that considering all of those carbon dioxide that is absorbed and all of those that are released, 5,000 is basically what is added to the atmosphere, and that leads to global warming. That then we have to limit the release. And to reduce the release, you have to either increase the absorption of the carbon dioxide, or you have to retain it through mass timber, for example, or find some interesting technology in order to capture CO2 that is currently being done actually, but the percentage of that CO2 capture is very minimal, that people argue that it cannot be currently, with the current technology, a viable solution at the global scale. So with regard to the second question, to what extent we could bring embodied carbon into more tangible discussions, I think we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, we talk about this. We have been talking about regional materials, traditional architecture, vernacular architecture. In a way, all of this is about embodied carbon. All of this is about sustainable buildings. I think the issue that is new is that we have this 5,000, then we have to limit it, and then we have to start now working with numbers, if we want to tackle this issue. And having good numbers is important, because if I build this building, I have to have a measure of whether I'm doing good or bad with regard to the carbon emissions associated with the materiality of this building. So we need benchmarks, good benchmarks. Not only good benchmarks, we need to also be able to quantify this embodied carbon of this, to compare my number with the benchmark, right? So in these two areas, we need good work. So there are a lot of good work in the field of developing good benchmarks. For example, a Carbon Leadership Forum, CLF, is a major, basically, entity in the United States that they're collecting a lot of data from firms, etc. to develop embodied carbon benchmarks. And they recently released their second version of the benchmark, which basically, if there is a magic number that I would like to communicate to you with regard to what is a good benchmark, would be perhaps, I would say, a 500 kilogram CO2 equivalent per square meter of a building. That is a measure of, if you go above that, that's bad, really bad. If you want to be good, you have to be around 200, 300. If you are 300 to 500, you're okay, but 500 is a bad threshold for us, I would say. So we need benchmarks, and we need to constantly quantify and then compare with the benchmark, with good benchmarks.
I would say there's another element to your question about, as architects, the embodied sense of carbon, how do we get to that? Is it we shift the curricula? How do we normalize this sense of carbon and embodied carbon as part of the design process? I think that's also where you were headed. Yeah.
I think it's a combination of a bottom-up approach and top-down approach. We need to work with the students. We need to inject this culture of you have to be concerned about these issues, and you have to gain skills that when you go to the field, you could speak with a new vocabulary that would be interesting and would be wanted. So from top down, we have to do this. By training students, we would affect the professional culture, but then there needs to be a top-down approach as well. For example, the governments must start to have policies and regulations in order to the controlled embodied carbon, like what they are doing with energy efficiency. So the first energy code, if I remember correctly, was developed in 1975. The first energy code was developed by ASHRAE, American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning. And then people started to add insulation. Before that, it was not a serious thing. So that top-down approach is also needed equally, I would say.
Nice, good. Yeah, absolutely, please.
So we're talking about the importance of this topic in relation to a global problem. And we see that the location where solution has been explored doesn't include the global south.
Yes.
And coming from Brazil, I've experienced that recently one of my advisors actually conducting research, and we had lots of difficulties with the data value.
Yes.
Because we just don't have enough information, and we had to find similar products for everything. So it was basically lots of assumptions, as you mentioned before.
Yes.
Here. How is this process for creating a local or regional database for materials? As you're talking about top down and bottom up, I'm thinking of like, is it an initiative from the academia? How does professional practice play a role in that? Or is it a top-down, like government mandate for producers to display like material, so I would like to hear from you about how to build that database and how Global South will, maybe if you have a vision of how that's going to be done in the Global South.
Sure, that's a great question. And I was recently asked a similar question. My answer was that you can't wait for the governments in Global South to start this process. So I suggested that the researchers who are interested in this area must start from small steps. You could start developing a database. You could start to learn about contacting a manufacturer that manufactures brick and starting to ask questions. How much electricity you consume in a month, and how many bricks you are able to produce. And then by all of these smaller steps, smaller pieces of data, you could start to develop small databases that as the awareness increases, people would be happy to contribute to that. That is how it happened in the West as well. And I think that would be a solution.
Let's get it started. Okay. Let's take 1, 2. You have the last question, and then we'll break for snacks and after party.
And I was thinking, because you said like in the Global South, and especially Africa, you said there isn't good data. But most of the building activity is going to happen in places
Exactly.
like that.
Yes.
So it's like really important that we do things there or allow the environment to be such that what I'm calling maybe homegrown things, not just, hey, we are doing here, you have to do this there, because that's not going to work.
Yes.
That's one. But the other thing is, I was struck by, the way we set up our metrics may also not be correct sometimes. Because, I was thinking if you say, you put out a number, whatever it be, doesn't matter. 300 per square meter is a good or bad.
Yes.
But what about, like in the US, we live in 3,000 square foot. What if somebody is using 500, but they're living in 700 square foot? So it's not just the material by itself and the area, it's a much larger way of looking at it. And having our metrics in that kind of performance-based or, however based, it's more difficult, I understand that. But I feel that this per area kind of thing is a very Western way, and also will not compute or transfer that well in other kinds
Completely
of
agree with you. I think the issue, oftentimes we focus on the issue of efficiency, improving efficiency, reducing our numbers, but we forget that demands need to be controlled as well. So the answer would be control efficiency and demand in parallel. But oftentimes within the field of built environment, our control is over efficiency. We can't control necessarily demand because demand has multiple layers that is beyond our control, from population growth to the government policies, to many layers that, yes, we could encourage lesser demand, but the actual control is not within our field. Actual control within the field of efficiency is, as architects, we could do that. But I completely agree. Without this, there's this example that sometimes I tell in my class to my students that there was the point of time that they said that if they use more efficient air conditioning units, the problem would be solved with regard to reducing the energy use related to the cooling of the building. But then when they made it more efficient, the cost went down. People were able to afford it more, and then they were able to use it more. So they made it more efficient, but the demand went higher. So the end result was that the consumption didn't go down in any way. Yeah.
Nice. Wow. That's a really intriguing answer. Yeah. You have the last question.
So you mentioned that obviously we can't wait around for the government to come in and do anything about this. So we as the architects or anyone in the field has to have an understanding and the tools of how much embodied carbon and operational carbon comes out of our buildings and our materials, or we can make our own databases. But do you have any idea, or has the government showed any steps of how long it would take for them to take any actions on these regulations?
That's a very good question, considering all of these changes that is happening. I don't know if previous steps would continue. I hope so. But I think there were some steps by previous administration that they tried to encourage by clean policies, where they were trying to encourage and in some areas force the federal contractors to basically purchase materials with low embodied carbon. There were some steps. There was no regulation in the sense that, well, report your embodied carbon or measure it or do this or that. No threshold. So I don't know if this will continue in this administration. I hope so. But I see that, for example, in Canada, they're doing amazing work. If you look at the Vancouver zoning policy or Toronto zoning policy, if you want to build a new building in Vancouver, you have to report your embodied carbon. So you have to measure it and report it. It's mandatory. You have to do it. And then I think starting from mid-2025, there were plans for them that you have to show that you are reducing the embodied carbon by 10% or 20%. So the plan was that by 2030, you would be able to significantly reduce the embodied carbon of your building. So a lot of good work in Canada. In the United States, I think there is a lot of awareness needs to happen. And awareness that I say is not necessarily awareness of students or public or professionals, it's awareness of policymakers. They need to learn about the impacts of the policies on the carbon emission. And that's why one of the, I mentioned about the research that my PhD student is doing about the impact of zoning policies. Because sometimes to me it sounds that, well, all of these zoning policies are designed without necessarily significant consideration of environmental impacts. So if you're saying that in downtown we have to build up to this height, 60 feet or 50 feet, or this floor area ratio, sometimes from the environmental perspective, these numbers sound random to me. And that's why we need to educate policymakers and urban planners about the impact of decision making. If you increase floor area ratio by 1 unit, or if you increase the height of the buildings by 10 feet in downtown areas, what would happen environmentally?
Right, like more intentional policy making than in those
Exactly.
senses.
Yes, we have to constantly, what is that bird? Is it called woodpecker?
Yes.
That we have to become like woodpeckers.
Yeah.
Constantly mention things in order for a change to happen.
I like that. All right, that's a good way to close this up. Be a woodpecker. Rahman Azari, the Routledge Handbook of Embodied Carbon in the Built Environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Carpenter, for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Nice job. Thanks.